Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Wyoming Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1887. The American frontier was still wild and untamed in many places, but civilization was rapidly encroaching. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed nearly 2 decades prior, and the once boundless wilderness was steadily giving way to settlements and industry. The Wyoming Territory, not yet a state, represented one of the last truly wild frontiers in the continental United States, a place where a man could still vanish without trace, swallowed by the vastness of mountains and forests that stretched beyond the limits of maps and understanding. It was during this time that an unusual event occurred near what locals called Devil's Ridge, a remote area in the eastern foothills of the Wind River Range. According to records from the Fremont County Sheriff's Office, dated November 12, 1887, a hunter by the name of Jedediah Harmon vanished without a trace while on an expedition near Devil's Ridge. What made this disappearance particularly unsettling was not merely the fact that Harmon was an experienced frontiersman who knew the territory well, but rather the peculiar circumstances surrounding his hunting cabin and the items discovered inside after his disappearance. Harmon was no ordinary hunter. At 47 years of age, he had spent nearly 3 decades traversing the Western Territories. Born in Vermont in 1840, he had migrated westward following the Civil War, like many restless men seeking fortune and purpose after the bloodshed. Unlike the amateur sportsmen who began arriving from eastern cities in the 1870s and 80s, Harmon possessed a deep knowledge of tracking, survival, and the ways of the wilderness. He was known in Lander and other regional settlements as a reliable guide, and a man of few words, but exceptional competence. According to accounts from those who knew him, he had never been known to lose his bearings or find himself in peril he couldn't navigate. The 1880s marked a transitional period in American hunting culture. The romantic notion of the frontiersman was giving way to more formalized sporting practices. Hunting clubs were forming in eastern cities, and wealthy urbanites were venturing west for guided expeditions. But Harmon represented an older tradition, a solitary hunter who lived by his skills and knowledge of the land. He supplemented his income by selling pelts and meat, occasionally serving as a guide, but preferred to work alone. This preference for solitude made his eventual fate all the more difficult to trace. What we know about the events leading up to Harmon's disappearance comes primarily from the journal of Marshall Caldwell, a land surveyor who was among the last to see him alive. In entries dated early October 1887, Caldwell described encountering Harmon at a trading post in South Pass City. The 2 men were acquainted from previous seasons, and Harmon mentioned he had established a new hunting cabin near Devil's Ridge, approximately 18 miles northeast of the settlement. Harmon appeared his usual taciturn self, Caldwell wrote, though he spoke with uncommon enthusiasm about his new hunting grounds. He claimed the area was teeming with elk and mule deer, and that he anticipated a profitable season. I noted that Devil's Ridge had an unsavory reputation among local inhabitants, both white settlers and indigenous peoples alike, but Harmon dismissed these concerns with characteristic stoicism. Old wives' tales, he called them, and nothing more was said on the matter. The trading post proprietor, Winston Sheffield, would later provide a statement to authorities that corroborated Caldwell's account and added a detail that would later seem significant. Harmon purchased more supplies than usual, Sheffield stated, including an unusual quantity of ammunition and oil lamps. When I remarked upon this, he mentioned something about the darkness coming earlier near the ridge, and that he didn't care for the shadows after sundown. It struck me as odd coming from him, a man I'd known to be completely comfortable in the wilderness at any hour. Sheffield's ledger, preserved in the Fremont County Historical Society archives, confirms this unusual transaction. Where Harmon typically purchased 1 or 2 bottles of lamp oil for an extended hunting trip, on this occasion he purchased 6. His ammunition purchase was similarly excessive, 40 rounds for his Winchester rifle, nearly double his typical order. The ledger also shows an entry for a new journal, a detail that would prove significant in light of later discoveries. Harmon departed South Pass City on October 8, 1887. According to his own stated plans, shared with both Caldwell and Sheffield, he intended to remain at his cabin until the first heavy snowfall, likely returning to civilization in late November or early December. This timeline was consistent with his usual patterns over previous years. The weather that autumn was reportedly mild by Wyoming standards. According to meteorological records from Fort Washakie, approximately 30 miles southeast of Devil's Ridge, October temperatures remained above average, with only occasional light precipitation. The first significant snowfall didn't occur until November 17th, well after Harmon's disappearance had been discovered. These conditions make the official explanation of his fate, exposure to the elements, difficult to reconcile with the experienced hunter's knowledge and preparation. It was the sudden arrival of his pack horse at the Wilkins Ranch, some 12 miles southwest of the presumed location of his cabin, that first alerted anyone to potential trouble. The animal appeared on November 2nd, still partially laden with supplies, but without its owner. Augustus Wilkins, the ranch proprietor, recognized the horse as belonging to Harmon, based on distinctive markings and the J.H. brand. Finding the appearance of the riderless horse troubling, particularly given Harmon's reputation for competence, Wilkins organized a small search party consisting of himself, 2 ranch hands, and a Shoshone tracker named Quiet Fox, who occasionally worked for him. In his later statement to Deputy Marshal Dunstan, Wilkins described the peculiar behavior of the horse. The animal was agitated in a manner I've never observed before. Horses that have lost their riders to accidents or attacks typically display signs of physical exertion, sweating, labored breathing, evidence of having run long distances. Harmon's horse showed none of these signs. It wasn't exhausted. It was afraid. It refused to eat for 2 days, and when we attempted to lead it in the direction from which it had come, it became unmanageable, rearing and pulling against the reins with such force that we abandoned the effort. In 20 years of ranching, I've never seen such behavior. The search party departed the following morning, using the general direction from which the horse had arrived and their knowledge of Harmon's approximate location to guide them. After nearly a full day's journey, they came upon a small clearing in a dense stretch of pine and aspen where Harmon's cabin stood. The structure was a simple 1-room affair built of hand-hewn logs, typical of the hunting cabins used by trappers and hunters throughout the region. What was immediately striking, according to Wilkins's subsequent report to authorities, was the absence of smoke from the chimney despite the cold November air and the unusual silence surrounding the cabin. No bird sang, Wilkins would later recall, and even the wind seemed to die as we approached. Quiet Fox became visibly disturbed, refusing to approach closer than 50 yards to the structure. When pressed, he would only say that the place had no spirit, and that something had taken all the living breath away. It was Wilkins himself who approached and entered the cabin. What he found inside was meticulously documented in the subsequent investigation conducted by Deputy Marshal Abernathy Dunstan, who arrived from Lander 5 days later. The cabin appeared to be in perfect order, with no sign of struggle or violence. Harmon's rifle, a Winchester Model 1873, was propped beside the doorway, fully loaded. His skinning knives were arranged on a small table, clean and oiled. Provisions were stocked neatly on shelves along one wall. 2 peculiarities stood out immediately. First, the cabin contained no game meat or animal pelts whatsoever, despite Harmon having been there for over 3 weeks in prime hunting season in reportedly game-rich territory. Second, every available surface of the interior walls had been covered with intricate, obsessively detailed drawings made with charcoal and what appeared to be crushed berries mixed with animal fat. The drawings, as photographed and described in Deputy Dunstan's report, depicted what seemed to be the surrounding forest landscape from various vantage points, but with one disturbing difference. In each drawing, hidden among the trees or partially obscured behind rocks, were elongated, shadowy figures. These figures were never drawn in full view, but were suggested through fragments. A stretched limb here, an unnaturally long finger there, a suggestion of a featureless face peering from darkness. The artistic skill evident in these drawings, Dunstan wrote, is inconsistent with any known samples of Harmon's handwork, he being a practical man not given to artistic pursuits according to all accounts. Furthermore, the sheer number of drawings suggests a frenzied production over many days, perhaps even weeks. Every wall space, including above the small sleeping area, has been covered. The effect upon entering is one of being surrounded by watchful eyes. Most unsettling was Harmon's journal, found open on the small table beside his bunk. The journal, which spans the period from October 9th through October 31st, begins with mundane entries about weather conditions and hunting prospects. By October 15th, however, the tone shifts dramatically. Harmon begins to mention sounds that don't match any animal I know, and movement in the trees that doesn't follow the wind. The entry from October 17th reads, 4 days with no game, not even tracks. The forest has emptied. I've hunted these mountains for years and never seen such absence of wildlife. It's as if everything has fled, everything except what moves at the corner of my vision. I turn my head, and there's nothing, but the moment I look away, I feel it again, something watching. By October 20th, the entries become increasingly disjointed. Can't sleep. The shadows move even when the lamp is lit. I've hunted these mountains for 20 years and never felt watched like this. Shot at a fine bull elk today at not 40 yards. Impossible to miss. But my bullet found nothing. The animal stood still, looking at me. It didn't blink. Nothing blinks here. October 23rd. The darkness at Devil's Ridge isn't like regular darkness. It has substance, weight. I swear it seeps through the cabin walls like water through cloth. I've used all my lamp oil, keeping it lit day and night. Still I see them watching. Still they whisper. They speak in a language I almost understand. The entry from October 26th consists of a single sentence repeated dozens of times, the handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. They are getting taller. They are getting taller. They are getting taller. The entry from October 28th shifts dramatically in tone, suggesting either a profound change in Harmon's mental state or, more unsettlingly, a different author entirely. We observe from within now. The vessel accommodates, imperfect, temporary. We learn, we stretch. Soon, no vessel needed. The final entry, dated October 31st, consists of just 3 sentences. They've been inside all along. They were here before me. They will remain after. Handwriting analysis conducted in 1962 by the Federal Bureau of Investigation at the request of the Wyoming Historical Society confirmed that all entries in the journal were written by the same hand, almost certainly Harmon's based on comparison with other documents known to be his. However, the report noted significant progressive deterioration in letter formation and line stability in the later entries, consistent with extreme fatigue, psychological distress, or the influence of intoxicating substances. Following this discovery, an expanded search effort was organized involving law enforcement officers from Lander and experienced trackers from both settler and indigenous communities. Despite thorough sweeps of a 5-mile radius surrounding the cabin over the course of 2 weeks, no trace of Jedediah Harmon was ever found. No remains, no clothing, no personal effects. The official report filed by Deputy Dunstan concluded that Harmon had likely suffered from a deterioration of mental faculties, possibly due to contaminated food supplies or undisclosed previous mental instability, and had wandered into the wilderness in a delusional state, subsequently perishing from exposure. The report noted that unusually early winter storms had moved through the region shortly after the initial discovery of the cabin, hampering search efforts and likely obscuring any remaining evidence. This official explanation did little to quell local speculation, particularly given Harmon's reputation and experience. The cabin itself became something of a local legend. For several years afterward, it remained untouched, as no one was eager to claim the property. According to accounts from the period, travelers and hunters deliberately altered their routes to avoid the vicinity of Devil's Ridge. In the spring of 1890, a lightning strike during an unseasonable thunderstorm reportedly set fire to the cabin, burning it to the ground. When a forest ranger named Patterson investigated the site that summer, he found only a scorched foundation and a single charred post remaining upright. In his official report, Patterson noted that despite the 3 years that had passed, no vegetation had reclaimed the clearing where the cabin had stood. "The ground remains as bare as a swept floor," he wrote, "as though nothing wishes to grow there." Patterson's report included a curious detail, not widely circulated at the time. The single remaining post, according to his measurements, stood exactly 7 feet 3 inches tall, significantly taller than would be typical for a cabin of the period, which rarely exceeded 6 feet in interior height. More puzzling still, he noted that the post appeared to have been deliberately carved with a repeating pattern of elongated, stylized human figures, similar to those described in Harmon's drawings. Patterson attributed this to the artistic license of an indigenous craftsman, whose work Harmon had perhaps incorporated into his cabin construction. The most peculiar follow-up to the Harmon case came in 1896, when a geological survey team mapping the Wind River Range discovered a series of unusual rock formations approximately 4 miles northeast of the former cabin site. The formations, according to the team's report, consisted of naturally occurring stone pillars, several of which bore markings that bore a striking resemblance to the elongated figures from Harmon's cabin drawings. The team's leader, Dr. Wesley Hammond of the University of Pennsylvania, included detailed sketches of these formations in his report, noting that, while likely the result of natural erosion processes, the uncanny similarity to the documented drawings from the Harmon case presents a troubling coincidence. More disconcerting is the fact that these formations would have been entirely invisible from the cabin site, being located on the far side of the ridge and down in a sheltered valley. How Harmon could have known of their existence, let alone reproduce their likeness, with such fidelity, remains unexplained. Hammond's report was filed with the U.S. Geological Survey in Washington, where it was archived and largely forgotten. When Dr. Hammond attempted to organize a return expedition the following year to study the formations more thoroughly, he found funding mysteriously withdrawn and permissions rescinded. According to his personal correspondence, discovered among his papers after his death in 1914, he was told informally by a government official that certain areas are better left unmapped. In 1924, a Princeton anthropologist named Morris Blackwood took an interest in the Harmon case while researching folklore of the Wind River region. Blackwood traveled to Wyoming and interviewed several elderly residents who remembered the incident. Among them was Elias Sheffield, son of the trading post owner who had last supplied Harmon before his disappearance. The elder Sheffield, who had been 35 in 1887, recalled that he had been deeply troubled by the case, far more than he had let on to authorities. "My father burned something the night they told him about finding Harmon's cabin," the younger Sheffield told Blackwood. I remember because it was unusual to use the fireplace in early November when we had plenty of wood stored for the real winter. He had a paper, looked like a letter, and he read it several times with his hands shaking before he put it straight into the flames. When I asked him about it years later, he would only say that Harmon knew what was coming for him, and that some warnings should die with the men who write them. Blackwood's subsequent research uncovered that in the month before establishing his cabin, Harmon had spent nearly 2 weeks with a small band of Eastern Shoshone, reportedly to negotiate hunting rights. What he actually discussed with them remains unknown, but according to Blackwood's interviews with tribal elders, the area now known as Devil's Ridge had a much older name in their language, one that roughly translated to the place where the shadow people stand. According to these accounts, the area had been considered forbidden territory for generations, not because it was sacred, but because it was feared. The elders described ancient stories of hunters who ventured there and returned changed, speaking of figures that could only be seen from the corner of one's eye and that grew taller at sunset, stretching impossibly toward the sky. One elder, a man named Two Ravens, who claimed his grandfather had known Harmon, told Blackwood a story that had not been included in any official records. According to Two Ravens, Harmon had sought out specific knowledge about Devil's Ridge, not just permission to hunt there. He showed my grandfather a drawing, Two Ravens said, a circle with strange markings and tall, thin figures standing around it. He wanted to know what it meant. My grandfather recognized it as the old sign of the shadow people and refused to speak of it. He warned Harmon to stay away from the ridge. But the white man said he had been dreaming of this place his whole life, that he needed to go there to understand the dreams. My grandfather told him, "Those are not your dreams. They are using your sleep to pull you to them." Harmon did not listen. Perhaps most disturbing was Blackwood's discovery of a surveyor's map, dated 1884, 3 years before Harmon's disappearance, which showed a notation at the approximate location of Devil's Ridge. The notation, made in a different hand than the rest of the map's markings, read simply, "Voices here. Do not camp after dark." Blackwood's research was never published. The manuscript was found among his personal effects after he suffered a sudden mental breakdown in 1926, following his return from a solo trip to the region. He spent the remaining 11 years of his life in the Menninger Sanitarium in Topeka, Kansas, reportedly refusing to sleep in darkness and constantly drawing intricate patterns on any available surface. The attending physician's notes indicate that Blackwood would only say that he had seen what Harmon saw and that they're patient, so patient, waiting for darkness. The land that once contained Devil's Ridge and Harmon's cabin was eventually absorbed into the Bridger-Teton National Forest. Modern maps show no feature with that name, though local residents still use it to refer to a particular densely forested area that hikers and campers tend to avoid, often without knowing exactly why. In 1968, a Forest Service ranger named Gerald Holcomb discovered an unusual object while clearing a fire break approximately half a mile from where historians believe Harmon's cabin once stood. The object, initially thought to be an unusually shaped root ball, was later identified as a severely weathered leather hunting pouch of late 19th century design. Inside was a single brass button, a fragmented compass with the glass shattered, and a small notebook with its pages fused together by decades of moisture. When carefully separated by conservators at the Wyoming State Archives, only one page retained legible writing, a single sentence that matches the handwriting in the journal recovered from Harmon's cabin. It reads, "They only look human in the daylight." The hunting pouch and its contents were cataloged and stored in the archives, where they remained until 1982, when a small fire damaged that section of the facility. According to the incident report, the fire was confined entirely to the storage drawer containing these items, despite no apparent ignition source. The items themselves were completely consumed, leaving only ash. As recently as 2004, hikers in the Bridger-Teton National Forest occasionally reported peculiar experiences in the general vicinity of the former Devil's Ridge, unexplained sounds, disorienting episodes where familiar trails suddenly seem unfamiliar, and a persistent feeling of being observed from just beyond the tree line. Forest Service officials attribute these reports to the disorienting nature of dense forest environments and the power of suggestion from local legends. Yet those who know the full story of Jedediah Harmon's disappearance might wonder if something more remains in those woods, something that waits with infinite patience, that stretches with the lengthening shadows, that whispers in a language almost understandable. Park Ranger Theodore Gaines, who served in the Bridger-Teton National Forest from 1977 to 1996, perhaps summarized it best in an oral history recorded for the Forest Service archives. There are places in the wilderness that feel wrong. Not dangerous in any way you can explain, just wrong. Most rangers I know wouldn't admit it officially, but we all have spots we won't camp alone. Devil's Ridge is one of them. Why? Can't say exactly. But I'll tell you this, I've spent 30 years in these forests and I've never once seen a hunter set up near that ridge. Not once. Animals avoid it too. It's like they all know something we've forgotten. Jedediah Harmon never returned from his hunting expedition in 1887. His body was never recovered. His story might have been completely forgotten, filed away as just another frontier tragedy, if not for the disturbing details that continue to surface decades after his disappearance. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case was revealed in 1957, when renovations to the old South Pass City trading post, by then converted into a small museum, uncovered a hidden compartment beneath a storage shelf. Inside was a sealed mason jar containing a single sheet of paper, a letter from Jedediah Harmon to Winston Sheffield dated October 7, 1887, the day before he departed for his final hunting trip. The letter read, "Sheffield, should I not return by first snow, do not send men looking. What follows me cannot be escaped, only delayed. I go to the ridge knowing what waits. The dreams have shown me. Perhaps in knowing I have some small advantage they do not expect. There are worse fates than disappearing. Harmon." The letter was donated to the Wyoming Historical Society but was later reported missing from their collections in 1961. The museum curator who originally discovered it died unexpectedly the following year, leaving no additional documentation of its contents beyond his initial catalog entry. An often overlooked aspect of the Harmon case involves the testimony of Ezekiel Montgomery, a trapper who claimed to have encountered Harmon approximately 2 weeks before his disappearance. Montgomery's statement, recorded by a journalist from the Cheyenne Daily Leader but never included in official reports, described meeting Harmon at a small encampment near Green River, roughly 30 miles southwest of Devil's Ridge. He wasn't himself, Montgomery recalled. Harmon was a man I'd known for years, steady as bedrock and twice as solid. But that night by the fire, he kept looking over his shoulder at nothing, jumping at sounds I couldn't hear. He told me he'd been having the same dream every night for a month, walking through the forest at dusk and finding footprints in the soil that started human but gradually lengthened and deepened until they weren't footprints at all, just long furrows in the earth that led toward the ridge. According to Montgomery, Harmon confessed that he believed something was compelling him to establish his cabin precisely where he did. He said he'd intended to set up near Twin Creeks, good hunting there, but each morning he'd wake having traveled miles in the night with no memory of walking. Always in the direction of the ridge, said it was like being pulled by an invisible rope. Montgomery also described how Harmon had changed physically in subtle but unsettling ways. He looked stretched, Montgomery said, like his joints were looser, his limbs longer than I remembered, and his eyes, they'd always been dark, but now they seemed to have no bottom to them. I told him he ought to get back to town, see a doctor. He just smiled in a way that didn't sit right and said, "It's too late for that. They've already seen me, and I've seen them." I left before dawn the next morning. Couldn't stomach another night near him. That weren't Jedediah Harmon no more, not entirely. Montgomery's account was largely dismissed at the time as embellishment or misremembered conversation, particularly given that he was known locally as something of a storyteller who enjoyed attention. However, a diary entry from Harmon dated September 18th, discovered among his personal effects in a trunk stored at a boarding house in Lander, contains a passage that seems to corroborate Montgomery's claim. The sleepwalking continues. Woke this morning 5 miles from where I made camp. Boots caked with mud I don't recall traversing. All was eastward, always toward that damned ridge. I fight it, but in sleep something else takes control. Perhaps it's merely curiosity drawing me. Perhaps I simply need to see it, and then this strange compulsion will cease. I leave for South Pass City tomorrow. We'll gather supplies for a proper expedition. Face this thing directly in daylight. This diary was not part of the official investigation, having been discovered only in 1902 when the boarding house changed ownership and unclaimed possessions were inventoried. By then, interest in the case had waned, and the diary was simply added to the County Historical Society's collection without fanfare. In 1933, during the depths of the Great Depression, a Works Progress Administration project included an oral history initiative that documented accounts from elderly residents throughout Wyoming. One of these interviews, conducted with Nathaniel Pierce, a former deputy who had been part of the expanded search for Harmon in 1887, revealed an unsettling detail omitted from official reports. "We found something the third day of searching," E.O. Pierce recounted, his voice captured on a scratchy recording preserved in the American Folklife Center. About a mile north of the cabin, in a small ravine, a circle of stones maybe 12 feet across with strange markings carved into each one. In the center was what appeared to be the remains of a fire, but Deputy Dunstan said it wasn't like any campfire he'd seen. The ashes formed perfect concentric circles like ripples in a pond, and they were cold, colder than they should have been, cold enough that frost had formed on them despite the surrounding ground being dry. Pierce went on to describe how Dunstan ordered the site documented but excluded from the official report. He said it would only add to the local superstitions, that we needed to provide rational explanations, not fuel for ghost stories. But I was there when the Shoshone tracker examined those stones. He wouldn't translate the markings directly, but he told Dunstan they represented a boundary, not to keep something out, but to keep something in. The recording ends with Pierce's haunting observation. Those stones were arranged in the exact same pattern as the last drawing in Harmon's journal, the one found beneath his bunk that wasn't included in the evidence, the one showing the elongated figures not hidden in the trees, but standing in a circle, facing inward. The WPA recording remained in archives until a graduate student named Rebecca Holt discovered it while researching Depression-era folklore in 1992. Her attempts to locate the original drawing mentioned by Pierce were unsuccessful, as many documents from the Harmon investigation had been lost in a courthouse fire in 1919. However, Holt's research led her to the journal of Martha Dunstan, wife of Deputy Abernathy Dunstan, which contained an entry dated November 20th, 1887. Abernathy returned from the Harmon investigation looking haunted. He burned his field notes in the stove tonight and scrubbed his hands until they bled. When I asked what troubled him so deeply, he would only say that some knowledge is a contagion best contained. He has forbidden me from speaking the name of Devil's Ridge in our home, and has requested a transfer to the eastern part of the territory, far from the mountains. I have never seen fear in my husband's eyes until now. Local interest in the Harmon case resurged briefly in 1976, when a hunting party reported finding unusual tree formations near the historical location of Devil's Ridge. According to their account, published in the Lander Journal, They discovered a stand of pines in which every tree had grown with an unnatural curve, all bending inward toward a central point, creating a dome-like structure of living wood. At the center was a small clearing where nothing grew. Wildlife biologist Dr. Camilla Vaughn investigated the site the following spring and attributed the formation to a combination of unusual soil conditions, prevailing wind patterns, and possibly an underground water source creating uneven growth. Her report noted, however, that the symmetry of the formation was statistically improbable, and that core samples from the trees indicated they had all begun their unusual growth pattern simultaneously, approximately 90 years earlier, coinciding roughly with the time of Harmon's disappearance. Dr. Vaughn's final assessment included a personal note. While science provides plausible explanations for individual elements of this formation, the totality of factors creating this precise arrangement stretches coincidence to its breaking point. I cannot shake the sense that these trees are responding to something our instruments cannot detect, something beneath. The formation was scheduled for further study, but before a research team could return, an unusually intense forest fire swept through the area in August 1977, destroying the unique stand of trees and altering the landscape significantly. The fire's point of origin was never conclusively determined, though lightning was officially cited as the probable cause despite the absence of thunderstorm activity reported in the vicinity on the day the blaze began. Forest Service maps were redrawn following the fire, and the exact location of the tree formation was lost. Subsequent attempts to relocate the site using Dr. Vaughn's original coordinates have been unsuccessful, with researchers finding the terrain doesn't match her descriptions or photographs. It's as if the land itself has rearranged, obscuring its secrets. In 2010, a digital restoration project at the Wyoming State Archives discovered a previously unreadable portion of Deputy Dunstan's original report through enhanced imaging techniques. The recovered text, badly water-damaged in the original, contained a puzzling postscript. The tracker, Quiet Fox, insisted I record his words verbatim, though I exclude them from official findings. He claims the land itself has become corrupted by what dwells at Devil's Ridge. They are ancient and patient, he said. They take a man's shadow first, then his dreams, then his form. They wear him like we wear clothing, but imperfectly. They study us. They have always studied us, and they are learning to imitate us better each time. I record this only for the sake of completeness, not credibility. To this day, the area where Jedediah Harmon's cabin once stood remains unusually silent, even in summer, when surrounding forests teem with wildlife and sound. Local guides, when pressed, will acknowledge the strangeness, but offer no explanations. Some places just don't want people, they'll say, and quickly change the subject. And on rare occasions, typically during the long twilight hours of late autumn, when shadows stretch across the landscape, hikers report glimpsing unusually tall, thin figures standing motionless among distant trees. By the time they look directly, there's nothing there but darkness gathering between the trunks. Nothing but the strange silence that has persisted for over a century. Nothing but the lingering mystery of a hunter who ventured into the wilderness and became part of it in ways we may never fully understand. The most recent development in the Harmon mystery occurred in 2018, when a university archaeological survey using ground-penetrating radar detected an unusual subterranean structure near the presumed location of Harmon's cabin. The anomaly, approximately 20 feet beneath the surface, appeared to be a perfectly circular chamber roughly 15 feet in diameter. Permit applications to excavate the site were submitted to both the Forest Service and the State Historical Preservation Office, but approval has been indefinitely delayed. According to internal memos obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, the delay stems from concerns about disturbing potential indigenous cultural sites. though no known tribal records indicate historical use of that specific location. Dr. Lawrence Schaefer, the geologist who led the survey, has expressed frustration with the bureaucratic obstacles. In an interview with Wyoming Public Radio in 2019, he stated, "Whatever lies beneath that ground isn't moving. It's been there at least since Harmon's time, possibly much longer. Science demands we investigate, yet something always interferes when we get close to approval. It's as if the bureaucracy itself becomes a barrier specifically around this location." The true depth of the mystery surrounding Jedediah Harmon's disappearance is perhaps best illustrated by a series of incidents that occurred during the winter of 1955-56, nearly 70 years after the original events. Cornelius Blackwood, the nephew of the anthropologist who had investigated the case in the 1920s, discovered a collection of his uncle's papers that had been stored in the attic of the family home in Princeton, New Jersey. Among these materials was a leather-bound portfolio containing sketches that appeared to be copies of the drawings found in Harmon's cabin. Blackwood, himself an amateur historian, became fascinated with the case and began corresponding with various authorities in Wyoming to learn more. In December 1955, he traveled to Lander to conduct his own investigation. His initial letters home described his excitement at uncovering what he believed to be new evidence related to the Harmon disappearance. "I've spoken with several elderly residents whose parents or grandparents were involved in the original search," he wrote to his wife on December 14th. "One fascinating detail emerges repeatedly. During the 2 weeks following the discovery of Harmon's empty cabin, at least 4 members of the search party reported encountering what they described as Harmon's shadow in the forest. Not Harmon himself, but what appeared to be his silhouette moving among the trees, always at dusk, always at the periphery of their vision. When they called out or approached, it would vanish." Blackwood's letters grew increasingly troubled as his stay in Wyoming extended into January. On January 8, 1956, he wrote, "Something peculiar is happening. I've begun having vivid dreams about Devil's Ridge, though I've never set foot there. In these dreams, I see the landscape exactly as it appears in my uncle's sketches, yet I'm moving through it as if I know the way. Last night I dreamed I was approaching a circle of stones in a small ravine. Standing within the circle were impossibly tall figures, their limbs elongated like the shadows cast by late afternoon sun. They turned to look at me in unison, and though they had no discernible facial features, I knew they were smiling. I woke drenched in sweat despite the cold room." His final letter, dated January 22nd, was addressed to the dean of the history department at Princeton University rather than to his family. It read in part, "I am convinced that what happened to Jedediah Harmon was neither accident nor madness, but something far more profound and disturbing. There is a presence in these mountains that defies conventional explanation. I have arranged to be guided to the approximate location of Harmon's cabin tomorrow. If I do not return, please ensure that my research notes are preserved but not published. Some doors, once opened intellectually, cannot be closed again. My uncle understood this too late. I fear I may be making the same mistake, yet I cannot resist the compulsion to see for myself." Cornelius Blackwood never returned from his expedition. A search party found his camp intact 2 days later, his equipment neatly arranged, his journal open to an entry that abruptly ended mid-sentence. "The shadows are moving against the wind. They seem to be coming toward—" No trace of Blackwood himself was ever found, creating an eerie echo of the Harmon case nearly 7 decades earlier. The official explanation cited a probable fall from one of the many steep ridges in the area, with the body likely covered by heavy snowfall before searchers could locate it. His remains have never been recovered. Perhaps the most unsettling echo of the Harmon case came in 1972, when the Fremont County Historical Society received an anonymous donation of a series of photographs taken in the vicinity of Devil's Ridge between 1887 and 1890. The images, shot on early dry plate glass negatives, were accompanied by no identification of the photographer or explanation of their provenance. Most of the photographs showed typical Western landscapes, mountain vistas, forest scenes, rock formations, but 3 images from the collection caused considerable disturbance among those who viewed them. These photographs, apparently taken near dusk, judging by the long shadows, showed the clearing where Harmon's cabin had stood. In 2 of the images, the cabin itself is clearly visible. In the third, taken from a slightly different angle, the cabin is absent, suggesting it was photographed after the 1890 fire. What disturbed viewers was not the subject matter itself, but what appeared in the background of each image. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by trees, are what seemed to be unusually tall, thin human figures. The image quality and the distance make details difficult to discern, but in each photograph, these figures are positioned differently, as if they had moved between exposures. Photographic experts from the University of Wyoming examined the negatives in 1973 and concluded they were authentic period photographs that showed no signs of manipulation or double exposure. Their report stated, "The figures visible in the background exhibit unusual proportions that could be attributed to optical distortion from the camera lens or to the subjects wearing some form of stilts or elevated footwear. However, the consistency of the anomalous proportions across multiple images taken from different angles suggests neither explanation is entirely satisfactory." The photographs were displayed briefly as part of an exhibition on frontier photography at the Wyoming State Museum in 1975, but were removed after several visitors reported feeling intensely uncomfortable after viewing them. One visitor reportedly fainted, and another described experiencing a profound sense of being watched that persisted for days afterward. The negatives have since been stored in the museum's climate-controlled archives, rarely accessed and never publicly displayed again. In 1999, Dr. Eleanor Voss, a professor of folklore at the University of Colorado, attempted to compile a comprehensive study of the Devil's Ridge legends, including the Harmon disappearance. Her research led her to interview dozens of individuals with connections to the area, including descendants of those involved in the original events. Among her most valuable sources was Marion Wilkins, the great-granddaughter of Augustus Wilkins, who had led the initial search party that discovered Harmon's abandoned cabin. Marion had inherited a collection of family papers that included her great-grandfather's personal journal, which contained details never included in his official statement to authorities. "There was something my great-grandfather never told the deputy marshal," Marion told Dr. Voss during a recorded interview. "He wrote it in his journal, but made my great-grandmother promise it would never be shared during his lifetime." According to his entry from November 3, 1887, when he first entered Harmon's cabin, he found something drawn on the underside of the table, hidden from casual view. It was a map of sorts, but not of any landscape he recognized. It showed concentric circles with strange angular symbols between them, and at various points along these circles were marks that resembled elongated human figures. The journal entry, which Dr. Voss was permitted to photograph, described how Wilkins had felt compelled to copy the drawing before leaving the cabin. "I know not why I felt I must reproduce this strange design," Wilkins wrote, "only that some force seemed to guide my hand, and that to leave without this knowledge would be dangerous." The journal included his copy of the drawing, concentric circles filled with symbols resembling no known writing system, with stylized figures positioned at regular intervals around the circumference of each circle. "My great-grandfather became obsessed with this drawing," Marion continued. "According to family stories, he began seeing the elongated figures everywhere, in the shadows of his barn, at the edges of his property at dusk, even in his dreams. My great-grandmother found him sleepwalking multiple times, always heading east toward the ridge. After the third incident, she burned the original drawing he had made. The sleepwalking stopped immediately, but my great-grandfather was never quite the same afterward. He refused to venture into the mountains again for any reason. Dr. Voss's research took an unexpected turn when she herself began experiencing unusual phenomena. In her research notes from April 2000, she documented a recurring dream in which she found herself standing in a forest clearing, looking at Harmon's cabin. In the dream, "I know I need to enter the cabin," she wrote, "but I'm aware that something is watching me from the trees. When I turn to look, I see only shadows that seem to move independently of the branches. Each time I have this dream, the shadows are closer to the clearing's edge." By June 2000, Dr. Voss had abandoned her research, citing personal reasons in a brief letter to her department chair requesting a sabbatical. She never returned to academia and reportedly moved to Maine, where she has declined all requests for interviews about her unfinished work on the Devil's Ridge legends. Another intriguing perspective on the Harmon case came from retired forester James McAllister, who spent 43 years working in the Bridger-Teton National Forest, including several seasons assigned to the district that encompassed Devil's Ridge. In a 2007 interview for a local history project, McAllister shared observations that had troubled him throughout his career. "There's a spot up there, I won't name it exactly, but those who know, where the forest behaves differently," McAllister stated. "Trees grow crooked, wildlife detours around it, even during migration. GPS equipment malfunctions. It's maybe 2 square miles of anomaly and thousands of square miles of normal forest. Science-minded folks attribute it to mineral deposits, unusual magnetic properties in the soil, that sort of thing. But I've worked forests my whole life, and I've never seen a magnetic deposit that makes animals go silent when they approach a particular area, or causes seasoned woodsmen to feel uneasy for no rational reason." McAllister went on to describe an incident from 1988 when he was training a group of seasonal rangers. "We were conducting standard wilderness navigation exercises about half a mile from where local lore places Harmon's cabin. Nothing unusual about the day. Clear skies, moderate temperature for June. Around sunset, one of the trainees, a young man named Paulson, who'd grown up in Wyoming and knew the mountains well, suddenly froze in place. When I asked what was wrong, he pointed to the ridgeline and said, 'Someone's watching us.' We all looked but saw nothing. Paulson insisted, becoming increasingly agitated, claiming he could see tall men standing between the trees. We cut the exercise short and headed back to base camp. Paulson resigned the next morning, left without collecting his gear. I ran into him years later in Cheyenne. Odie asked him about that evening. All he would say was, 'The Forest Service doesn't pay enough to deal with what's up there.'" A curious footnote to the Harmon case emerged in 2008 when researchers at the American Philosophical Society discovered a letter from Dr. Wesley Hammond, who had documented the stone formations in 1896, to William James, the renowned philosopher and psychologist. Dated December 1897, the letter described Hammond's increasing concerns about his own mental state following his expedition to Devil's Ridge. "I find myself drawing the same figures repeatedly," Hammond wrote, "elongated forms that I first observed etched into those stone pillars. They appear in my idle doodling, in the margins of my lecture notes, even in the frost patterns on my window that I could swear were not there when I retired for the evening. More disturbing still, I sometimes glimpse similar silhouettes at the edges of my vision, particularly as daylight fades. They vanish when directly observed, yet I feel their presence with increasing certainty. James, you have studied the boundaries of human perception and consciousness more thoroughly than most. Tell me, is it possible for a location itself to imprint upon the mind? Can a place embed its essence into those who study it too closely? I fear I have brought something back with me from Wyoming, something that cannot be cataloged or classified, something that waits in the shadows of my perception. James's response, if one existed, has never been found. Hammond took his own life 6 months after writing the letter, leaving behind hundreds of pages of increasingly disjointed notes about what he called the Watchers, and their ability to fold themselves into the spaces between moments. In his comprehensive analysis of wilderness disappearances, author Gregory Patterson suggests that the Harmon case represents a particular category of incident in which the victim appears to have been claimed rather than simply lost. What distinguishes these cases, Patterson writes, is the sense that the disappearance itself was merely the culmination of a process that began well before the person vanished. Harmon's sleepwalking, his compulsion to establish his cabin at that specific location, his increasing paranoia and obsessive drawing, all suggest he was responding to something that had already marked him, already begun the process of absorption, long before he physically disappeared. This perspective frames the mystery not as a sudden, unexplained event, but as the final stage of a gradual transformation from independent human consciousness to something else entirely, something perhaps more integrated with the peculiar properties of that specific landscape. If one accepts this interpretation, then Harmon's final journal entry, "They've been inside all along. They were here before me. They will remain after," takes on a more profound and disturbing meaning. It suggests a recognition on Harmon's part that the boundary between self and other, between human and environment, had already dissolved, that what he perceived as external entities watching from the forest had already permeated his consciousness, perhaps had always been present in some dormant form, waiting for the right conditions, the right location to emerge. What makes this interpretation particularly unsettling is its implication that similar potentials might exist within all of us, dormant aspects of consciousness that could be activated under specific circumstances in specific locations where the boundaries between known and unknown, between self and other, grow thin. If Harmon was indeed claimed by Devil's Ridge, it was perhaps not because something alien invaded his consciousness, but because something latent within human perception was awakened and amplified by whatever strange properties that location possesses. From this perspective, the many researchers and investigators who have been affected by the Harmon case over the decades might be understood not as victims of some external malevolence, but as individuals who, through sustained attention to the details of the case, unwittingly activated similar dormant potentials within themselves. Their dreams, their obsessive drawing, their sense of being watched, all echo Harmon's experience, suggesting a pattern that replicates across time and distance once certain thresholds of awareness are crossed. The most scientifically rigorous attempt to understand the phenomena associated with Devil's Ridge came in 2020, when a multidisciplinary team from the University of Wyoming, funded by a private research foundation, conducted an environmental survey of the general area. The team included geologists, botanists, wildlife biologists, and anthropologists equipped with state-of-the-art monitoring equipment. Their preliminary report, published in the Journal of Anomalous Environmental Phenomena in 2021, documented several unusual findings. A roughly circular area approximately 8 miles in diameter, exhibited soil chemistry markedly different from surrounding terrain, with elevated levels of certain rare earth elements and unexplained organic compounds. Within this area, plant growth showed statistically significant abnormalities, including altered lignin structures in trees and unusual mycorrhizal networks in soil samples. Wildlife monitoring cameras captured 78% less animal activity within the anomalous zone compared to control areas with similar terrain and vegetation. Audio recordings detected unusual infrasound frequencies throughout the area, particularly intense at dusk and dawn, below the threshold of human hearing, but potentially capable of affecting mammalian nervous systems. Most intriguingly, time-lapse photography revealed what the researchers termed anomalous shadow phenomena, instances where shadows appeared to move independently of their casting objects, particularly during twilight hours. The team's lead researcher, Dr. Sofia Martinez, concluded the report with an unusually candid assessment. While we can document the existence of these anomalies with scientific instrumentation, our current scientific frameworks provide inadequate explanations for their origin or nature. Whatever is occurring in this location represents either an entirely novel natural phenomenon or something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of environmental systems. The research team planned to return for a more comprehensive study in 2022, but the project was indefinitely postponed following the unexplained disappearance of 2 graduate students during a preliminary survey expedition in late 2021. The students, experienced wilderness researchers, vanished while setting up monitoring equipment approximately a quarter mile from the estimated location of Harmon's cabin. Despite an extensive search effort using helicopters, drones, and tracking dogs, no trace of either researcher has been found. The Harmon case represents a particularly unsettling example of the mysteries that permeated the American frontier experience, instances where the vast wilderness seemed to consume individuals in ways that defied conventional explanation. While most disappearances could be attributed to the natural dangers of the environment, some, like Harmon's, hinted at something more profound and disturbing. What makes the Harmon case so enduring is not merely the absence of a body or concrete evidence of his fate, but the psychological imprint it left on those who investigated it, the way it seemed to reach beyond its original boundaries, affecting those who merely sought to understand it decades and even centuries later. The story of Jedediah Harmon and Devil's Ridge persists as a reminder that even in our modern world of satellite mapping and GPS coordinates, there remain places in the wilderness where human presence feels unwelcome and intrusive, places where the natural order seems subtly but fundamentally altered, places where the boundaries between observer and observed, between hunter and hunted, become disturbingly fluid. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the mystery is how it continues to resist definitive explanation, despite multiple investigations across generations. Each attempt to understand what happened to Harmon seems to add new layers of ambiguity rather than clarity, as if the truth itself is something organic and evolving, shifting beneath the weight of scrutiny like forest shadows at dusk. In the end, what remains is a narrative composed more of questions than answers. What compelled an experienced frontiersman to establish his cabin in an area locally known to be forbidding? What explains the absence of any game in a reportedly abundant hunting ground? Who or what created the drawings that cover the walls of his cabin? And perhaps most disturbingly, if Harmon did not create those drawings himself, who did? These questions have no satisfactory answers, at least none that conform to our conventional understanding of reality, and perhaps that is why the story of Jedediah Harmon continues to unsettle us more than a century after his disappearance. It suggests that even in the supposedly mapped and measured world of the late 19th century, there remained spaces where human comprehension faltered, where the wilderness itself seemed to possess agency and intent beyond our understanding. For those who venture into the remote reaches of Wyoming's mountains today, the name Devil's Ridge may have faded from official maps, but its legacy lingers in the instinctive unease felt in certain remote clearings, in the inexplicable silence that sometimes falls in forests normally teeming with life, in the fleeting peripheral glimpses of elongated shadows that seem to stand upright among the trees. As Park Ranger Theodore Gaines observed, some places in the wilderness simply feel wrong, and perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Harmon case is the suggestion that this wrongness is not merely a projection of human fear onto neutral landscape, but something inherent in the land itself, something ancient and patient that was there long before humans arrived and will remain long after we are gone. In the final analysis, the story of Jedediah Harmon is not simply a tale of a man who vanished in the wilderness. It is a reminder of the fundamental mystery that lies at the heart of our relationship with the natural world, a world that, despite all our technological advances in scientific understanding, remains in many ways as unknowable and potentially threatening as it was to our ancestors. A world where sometimes stepping off the beaten path means crossing boundaries not meant to be crossed. And somewhere in the remote reaches of the Wind River Range, where few hikers venture and even wildlife seems scarce, there is a place where the shadows grow long and strange as the sun sets, where the silence feels alive with watchful intent, where the boundaries between the known and unknown world grow thin. It is a place that has been claiming those who venture too close for centuries, leaving behind only questions and a lingering sense of wrongness that time has not diminished. Jedediah Harmon was neither the first nor the last to disappear there, but his story, preserved in fragments across generations, serves as both warning and temptation, a reminder that some mysteries are perhaps better left unexplored, yet continue to draw us inexorably toward them, like moths to a flame or sleepwalkers toward a distant ridge.